From our studios in the Motor City, this is Autoline. Here now is John McElroy.
Welcome to this edition of Autoline Detroit, where we're going to be talking all about the UAW and where it is going now and in the future. And joining me this morning is Bob Chiaravalli from Strategic Labor and Human Resources. Great having you here, Bob.
Thanks.
Also, Sean McElinden from the Center for Automotive Research and Joe Cesny from the Oakland Press. Great having all of you here. Okay, we've all been watching the UAW. It's gone through enormous change, really almost as big a change as the Detroit 3 automakers have gone through. Where do you guys see this thing going? What's the union status going forward? Is this a mortally wounded union that's not going to survive? Is it just going to limp along and continue as it has, or is it poised to grow again?
Well, maybe I'll just weigh in first. Their membership is very, very low. Eons ago, when I used to work there, where they were approaching 1.2 million, now they're at 350,000, and the question is, can the union exist at that level? And when I'm asked that question, oftentimes I say, sure. But they're going to get rid of a lot. They're so tied to the auto industry that when that goes down, they go down with it. So what kind of union will they be? Well, my bet is that they're going to survive, but it's going to be a heck of a lot smaller, and they're going to be looking at different ways to increase membership.
Yeah, Bob King said during the convention that one of the things he wanted to do was diversify the membership base, but they're still heavily wedded to the auto industry. I mean, there's no way they can get around it. And so thus, one of the things he stipulated that he was going to go after Toyota to try and organize that, which is kind of a gamble for him, because otherwise, if he misses, he's going to make the union look weaker again. So it's interesting to see what's going to happen there.
Well, I think they're still above break even, and even at 355,000. So we shouldn't panic too much. We're at record low, 30-year low production levels that will recover the next 2 or 3 years.
Right, and add members.
And we're at capacity utilization rates already we haven't seen in years. I think they're going to add tens of thousands of members that will be second tier, many of them, for a while.
Second tier in terms of working at suppliers, or are you talking about the sub-wage, the two-tier wage?
The new two-tier agreement will make it fairly easy for our companies to bring people back.
But you have to consider that the suppliers are really where the game's going to be played. I mean, you know what the multipliers are on the employment, and what they have there is a completely changed market where you have a supplier that is so attached to one auto company, they can bring the cost down to zero. They can do everything with productivity. That platform goes down, and it doesn't matter. And when you look at the supplier base, you're looking at 20, 25 different international unions that are spread out. If you look at 1950, almost 100% of suppliers were unionized. Today, if you add in the transplants, it's probably 10%. If you take the transplants out, it's probably something south of 25%. Any mistake there is going to be a big mistake.
Although the union has, there were a couple of stories they told recently that I was impressed with the fact that they had gotten back into Dana. They had used some different tactics to get back into, and Dana is now about 90% unionized, where before it had been very, very low unionized. And they had used some clever tactics to win a new contract and force Daimler to bring truck work back into the United States. And I thought those were, I thought they showed a little bit of imagination in both campaigns in that case, which I think I think King would like to promote now going forward.
Many of these supplier jobs used to be inside of the big three and were UAW jobs. They were outsourced.
Right.
And the point of the second tier wage agreement was to compete directly with these supplier jobs. Another positive point is that the dollar is at historically low levels. And so a lot of imported automotive parts aren't as competitive as they once were, certainly not from Japan and possibly some other countries very soon. Those are good points. One thing that scares me is over 50% of the parts being shipped in the U.S. today from component plant suppliers are from foreign-owned auto suppliers who are historically opposed, obviously, to the UAW, and it's going to be tough to organize those plants.
Well, even if you consider the American ones, I don't see any of them warming up to the UAW and saying, come on in, unless they have a partnership agreement, some kind of neutrality agreement, and unless the UAW thinks about how they're going to present themselves to any of these non-union places. That is, we can bring productivity, we can bring safety, we can bring quality. If they go back to the old game, like they showed that they were going to do at Toyota, they're going to be in trouble. And I don't know about you, but the last time I was at the dinner table, there were 2 generations ago that we were talking unions, labor relations.
Right. I think that's probably the biggest problem is that the culture in the United States has shifted so much that there's not a lot of sympathy for unions in the larger culture right now, and I think that's one.
Not even amongst working class people.
No.
Yeah, but there is more sympathy in Washington. Obviously, there is now a Democratic majority in NLRB. They're not going to get the new bill they want, but there's a very sympathetic administration. These are things they certainly didn't have to work with for years.
And a more sympathetic NLRB, a National Labor Relations Board. Now, the other thing that you have to watch, and I think this is going to be interesting as it plays out in Mississippi, Toyota recently announced that it's going to reopen the plant in Mississippi. My guess is, and I think it's a good one, is that nobody will make more than $12 to $14 an hour there, because Toyota is bound and determined to try and lower its wage costs. Sean, you did a study recently that showed that the big three are catching up. You don't think that didn't go unnoticed in Tokyo?
Well, before Saida left, the Japanese head of North America and Toyota Manufacturing, he said our goal is to pay 30% above local regional average for manufacturing. We want to be the top wage payer, but we don't believe in a national wage rate, like out of Georgetown or something like that. So we're probably talking $17 to $20 an hour. We'll get them the best labor in half of Mississippi till they hit Nissan or something. And obviously, that's well below the wage rate they're paying in their.
And certainly, the full-up cost has to be at or below $30 an hour, because after that, they're going to have all different kinds of problems.
Right.
And if the last time you look at Toyota, their average age is what, 42, 43 years old. They're starting to think about some legacy benefits. That is where potentially the UAW is going to be able to address the needs of that constituency at Toyota. You know, a little while ago it was 32 years old. They weren't thinking about pension. They weren't thinking about this stuff.
Well, for Bob, the plan is Georgetown. The big three have agreed, the Detroit three have agreed that's the parity plan.
And there is Georgetown, Kentucky plant for Toyota.
Complex. They signed a parity agreement with GM and Chrysler as part of the bankruptcy plan that said that they can't ask for improvements, that are higher than, the transplant, labor cost, and without the use of an arbitrator. Okay, they have to actually go to that to get any kind of an improvement. So for Bob to get these concessions overturned, and he referred to this in his speeches, okay, at the convention in a different way 4 or 5 times. He actually has to drive up Georgetown labor costs, and then he can go to GM and Chrysler and say, look, their labor costs are higher. Now we can pull those certain concessions
But
back.
at the same time, he's under enormous pressure from the union to gain back the concessions that they've given.
That's why, but legally, under the contract that he signed for bankruptcy through 2015, he has to, it will be compared with Georgetown.
And that's one of the tricky things he has to deal with now going forward, is that the membership, the union's membership is in flux, and a lot of them are disgruntled with the wage cuts, and they want to see some of them come back. So he has to balance between what Sean says on the bankruptcy side, but he also has to appease his own members. So
the tail of the ticker, when you look at industrial relations outcomes, remuneration, pay systems, security systems, and governance systems. And if the last 10 years we've been in an industry restructuring, all of those things have been hit. Even when times were good, the UAW was giving away 2 or 3% of its membership at the OEMs. And so how do you go to this non-union community and say, we're going to get that back from you, when the tail of the ticker says that ain't going to happen?
We've got to start with a victory, and that, sort of a wired victory, and that victory obviously is NUMMI, where he's going to claim it's a victory over Toyota when it's actually a Tesla plant financed by the Obama administration in the state of California.
Well, I think President King, hard worker, intelligent guy, he is a transformational leader. There's no doubt about that in my mind. But does one guy turn that whole block of regional organization, that whole block of local organizations, and move them away from these bread and butter outcomes?
He's pretty ambitious. I mean, I read a story in Metro Times this week where Jack Lessenberry told the anecdote that he came into the UAW, went to work at Ford Motor Company in the 1970s with the idea that he would become UAW president, which is pretty bold, and he did it. So I don't think I wouldn't underestimate him. I think I do agree he faces a lot of challenges, but he's had a lot of chutzpah over the years.
Oh, absolutely. This is a completely different president, I think, than the last 2 or 3. This is a guy who believes in organizing, who's led it since the late 90s, was the first vice president of organizing. He is an in-the-street guy, and now he can put the whole power of the presidency of the UAW behind that effort.
Which is still considerable. I mean,
Which is considerable. And their alliance with the AFL-CIO is as good or better than it's ever been. So he'll have a lot of cooperation and from the administration, and he knows how to use it. The focus won't be that much on the big three as the past.
And he's done a lot of outreach with unions overseas. I think you're going to see a much, going forward in the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see more unions come together internationally to try and fight this.
We are seeing the more intelligent leaders reaching out to Europe, Asia, even Central and South America. But if you go to a Japanese union and say, we're all into solidarity, will you please pressure your transplant in the United States to give us more work? That's going to go so far as to when that foreign manufacturer says, okay, we're bringing work to North America. Those are very fragile alliances. I think the biggest inroad for that was when DCX was on board with Daimler Chrysler, and they had to put a UAW president on their supervisory board. In that situation, they could actually influence the direction of the company by saying there will be a certain level of content, there will be a certain level of union membership, membership development. I don't think that is as strong a connection now as it was,
But the Japanese unions also face some serious issues of their own. Production in Japan is going down permanently, and they're facing a loss of jobs, and they're concerned about the same issues. Their issues are beginning to align with those of the UAW. They're facing plant closings, they're facing loss of jobs, they're facing loss of production. So there are some areas where they can begin to line up, and I think to pressure companies like Toyota and Nissan.
Well, let's face facts. I mean, without the UAW and its political network and all the chips they collected over 60 years in Washington, we wouldn't have been bailed out last year. Right. Every last red cent, $86 billion, came to those companies because of the UAW. And that money, much of it, some of that cash still around, it has to be invested here and in Canada. Okay, not thrown around the world or to Opel like there's a lot of talk on. So that's a card you have to play. They can't screw it up and look expensive and look like they're good. I mean, obviously it was very unpopular outside of Michigan and the rest of the country. And obviously they did use up every single chip they had. But it was their politicians that went out and got it and brought it back. And there should be, I think, some payback in this agreement, at least on investment, a new product.
I agree with Sean. I think one of the pressure points is going to be investment in Mexico. I think you're going to see some of those flows start to reverse on this new agreement.
But there's going to be a top limit as to how many members are going to gain as these plants come up and running. There's some limits to how many people the OEMs and the suppliers are going to put back on.
One project to watch is Ford has a small truck that they want to build somewhere. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's one of the demands from the UAW is that truck be built in the United States.
Well, one of the differences right now and why the big three were loath to invest in small cars, they had to build them in the U.S. for CAFE purposes, and they knew they'd lose money on every single one that they built. And so how do you go to the board of directors and say, hey, we need $1 billion for a new car, and guess what? We're never going to make a dime on it. Well, those days are gone.
Right.
With the new labor agreements, and that's why Ford's going to build the new Focus here in Michigan. You can do it profitably.
Right, and Ford and the UAW will give you a clean sheet labor agreement for any new plant that you want to build here, and any new project you want to build in the United States.
There's already worries at Ford, though, that with a more expensive agreement next year, and they figure themselves obviously to be the target, there's no parity agreement at Ford, no strike pledge, that Focus, that break-even proposition under Focus, not only in Wayne plant but down in Louisville, where all the other models will be, is in danger.
But isn't that the very danger that the Detroit Three face, is that, the UAW is not the reason they collapsed, but it sure was a reason why they collapsed.
It was a major factor.
A major factor. Yeah. So how does the union avoid going back to that? It's a political organization. You get elected to these positions, and you don't get reelected by saying, hey, let's do what management wants to do.
Solidarity House doesn't have the same kind of control over the regions and the locals that some other unions do, because those regional directors are elected. And so there is a little bit of a cat and mouse game going on. The biggest problem is going to be we're still in an economy that's recovering. The OEMs are still very fragile. You're not going to get a strike at Chrysler because they have the interest arbitration agreement. But let me tell you, it would be the stupidest thing in the world to see a strike at the General Motors or Fords, because they are still so fragile. They're going to have to use whatever they can in terms of negotiating prowess to craft a reasonable agreement, no work stoppage.